Most people who are familiar with the Jeffrey Epstein place probably think about things like his Lolita Express private jet, his private island, Little St. James, his Palm Beach mansion, and even his New York City apartment. What most people don't think of is that he also owned a palatial mansion in New Mexico called Zorro Ranch. And some of the allegations about what went down there are extremely creepy in addition to everything we already know about Jeffrey Epstein. But what's particularly insidious is that the federal government prevented New Mexico authorities from fully investigating the ranch back in 2019. New Mexico authorities have since reopened that investigation, but in the meantime, the property changed hands as well as plans with what to do with the estate. Like I mentioned before, out of all of Epstein's properties, his private jet, and his other affiliations, Zorro Ranch in New Mexico is probably the least known about and the most underexamined. But it's also one of the most interesting properties because it existed in this incredibly remote desert area and has yet to even be fully investigated. In photos of the estate, you can see that it exists on this sprawling patch of land, really insulated from surrounding neighbors or anyone who could scrutinize what was happening there. There was also this massive helipad, and the mansion itself was gigantic. At the time that Jeffrey Epstein lived here, this was considered one of, if not the largest private residence in New Mexico, similar to the largest apartment in New York City, which he also owned and operated at the same time. Now, two of the most prominent victims of Jeffrey Epstein who have come forward and testified publicly are Maria and Annie Farmer. Two sisters who both allege that they were sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And Annie's story takes place on Zorro Ranch. Just a few months ago, Annie Farmer sat down for an interview with Boston's NPR, and she talked about what happened when she went to visit Epstein in New Mexico. At this time, Annie explained, her older sister, Maria, had already established a working relationship with Epstein, who was promising to help her get connections in the art world. Maria Farmer would go on to have her own allegations against Jeffrey Epstein that took place in part at an Ohio home once owned by the billionaire Les Wexner. But at the same time, Epstein was in communication with Maria's younger sister, Annie, and their mother. He convinced their mother to let Annie come visit him in New Mexico, which she said to NPR was thought of as an exciting opportunity at the time. Specifically, she said, I had mentioned that I'd been interested in doing some sort of community service trip and that he thought that could be a great thing for me for my application. But of course, now I understand that was a hook. But that also gave us a reason to talk, that he wanted to help me plan where I should go and what I should do. And so then a short time later, he suggests to my mom that it would be a good idea for me to fly out to New Mexico, that he and his partner Maxwell will be there, and along with others because he likes to help young people go on these types of trips. So then Annie and the NPR host describe how grooming family members and parents can be a huge facet in child sexual abuse. And then they revisit the topic of New Mexico. Annie says, and I went to New Mexico for this weekend with them. And my mom took me to the airport. It was not a secret. We thought this was a great opportunity. The host says, Annie, what happened after you got on that airplane and went to New Mexico? And she said, you know, what happened in New Mexico was, I think, followed what we've heard in a lot of these stories. There was more grooming, right? I met Maxwell. She really focused on making me feel special in these ways, taking me shopping, giving me attention. She was so interested in what I had to say. And then we went horseback riding. It was this huge ranch, right? So they were showing me around and it all feels surreal. Then, interspersed throughout that, are these moments of trying to, I think, confuse my boundaries and normalize things that were not normal. Things like, you're going to learn how to rub Jeffrey's feet now, right? And Maxwell sits down next to me and begins rubbing his feet and showing me what I should do to rub his feet and massage him. And so that proceeds over the weekend. And there's a moment then when Maxwell is giving me a massage and exposing my body and touching my chest. And eventually Epstein's crawling into bed with me. And so throughout the whole weekend, there'd be moments of fear and what is happening here. And then trying to kind of talk myself out of that. I'd think, no, maybe I'm just misunderstanding. Maybe they just really love massage. They want me to experience that, right? So there's this kind of cycle that plays out. And then ultimately, the weekend's over, I go back home and I don't talk to anyone. The sisters, Maria and Annie Farmer, later told each other about what Epstein had done to them. The two of them would go on to testify. And also, crucially, Maria Farmer attempted to report Epstein to authorities for decades. Her first FBI report against Epstein was taken in 1997, and the US government did nothing. In fact, they went on to do worse than nothing, as we'll get into in a minute. In addition to Annie Farmer's testimony about the grooming and sexual abuse she endured at Epstein's ranch in New Mexico, the Department of Justice has also released Epstein files that include some pictures of what happened at the ranch. These photos are particularly disturbing in light of what we know now, the types of experiences that Annie Farmer relayed all these years later. We have pictures of the ranch at the time Epstein was living there. As you can see, it's a massive mansion in this type of Southern style that was sort of eponymous in a lot of New Mexico architecture. Inside, there was this indoor pool. We see a lot of these types of photos in the Epstein files of these just really elaborate, sort of elite signals of wealth that Epstein commanded at all of his various properties. He has this target practice out back. We don't know who these men are in this photo. One person is redacted. And then, perhaps most disturbingly, we have photos of young women on Zorro Ranch whose faces have also been redacted. We see them here pictured with a caboose that Epstein bought and put on the property. These are obviously very young women, even though we can't see their faces. We can tell that based on the clothing that they wear, their appearance. You can see someone sitting in Epstein's office here whose face is redacted. You can see how remote this property was and how there was no one around for these young women to go to for help when these situations occurred. There's another picture of the Santa Fe caboose he had installed on the property, a picture of him with it. And again, another picture of very young women sitting on the property with their faces redacted. Yesterday, the New York Times published a report about the lack of investigations that have taken place at Zorro Ranch and why that is. The Times writes, a state-led inquiry into Mr. Epstein's actions was taken over by federal prosecutors in 2019 and then apparently fizzled, according to New Mexico officials and recently unsealed records. A local Albuquerque radio DJ who has spent years researching Epstein, Eddie Aragon, said not only has it been overshadowed, it's been completely ignored. Everyone was paying attention to Paris, Little St. James, New York, and Miami, but they didn't pay attention to Zorro Ranch. There's Eddie Aragorn. The New York Times went on to report last month, lawmakers in New Mexico, spurred by the Justice Department's latest release of Epstein documents, voted unanimously to change that, impaneling a bipartisan 4-member Truth Commission in the state legislature, equipped with subpoena power to probe the sordid history of Zorro Ranch. The state's attorney general also announced he would reopen an investigation his office had closed shortly before Mr. Epstein's death in 2019. Andrea Romero, a New Mexico state representative from Santa Fe who is leading the commission, said, we need to find out how he was able to operate without any accountability. We have to understand what allowed this to happen. But there's a massive complication here in New Mexico's search for accountability and truth in this case. After New York prosecutors asked New Mexico to drop its investigation in the summer of 2019, Jeffrey Epstein died in a jail cell. And after that, the investigation ran dry. It's now been almost 7 years since that happened. And in the meantime, while this property was laying dormant and uninvestigated, the property ownership switched hands. So the New York Times reports the new owner, a Dallas real estate magnate and former state senator named Don Huffines, is running for comptroller of Texas, though he has said he will cooperate with law enforcement. But the state representatives tasked with investigating the ranch are now concerned that evidence may have been lost during that massive 7-year gap and through the time that the property changed ownership. And that new owner, Mr. Huffines, said recently, according to the New York Times, that he was planning to turn the property into a Christian retreat. Quote, law enforcement had not contacted him about getting access to the premises, he said, but he would comply if they did. Mr. Huffines has renamed the place San Rafael Ranch after the patron saint of healing. He is building a new front gate, and when it is complete, he said, the stone arch above the entrance will read, Blessed are those who come in the name of the Lord. I don't know what would compel someone to specifically want to build a Christian healing retreat on a former property owned by Jeffrey Epstein where child sexual abuse took place. But it doesn't sound great when you put it like that. In addition to that, there are new disturbing allegations that have been revealed in the newly released Epstein files. The Times reports an anonymous tip from someone who claimed to have worked at the ranch said Mr. Epstein concealed the deaths of two abused girls by ordering them to be buried in the hills outside the ranch. It is unclear whether the FBI ever looked into the tip. So, again, going back to these photos in the Epstein files, looking out at that desert plain outside Zorro Ranch, there are allegations that literally that's where the bodies are buried. And New Mexico authorities haven't been able to look into this for more than a decade, in which time a former Republican state senator has managed to purchase the property and repurpose it for, again, a Christian healing retreat. It's like the stuff of disturbing fiction, but it's all real. Time and time again, with regards to Jeffrey Epstein, we have examples of federal prosecutors, the Department of Justice, and the FBI failing to even investigate these reports of allegations, dating all the way back to the report Maria Farmer made to the FBI in the 1990s. Nothing came from that. Imagine the injustices that could have been stopped if the FBI had actually done its job. David Enrich, the business investigations editor at the New York Times, has a new thread and article digging into other missed opportunities the feds didn't take to investigate and prosecute Jeffrey Epstein. Writing, federal investigators repeatedly missed chances to catch Epstein. In 2019, they pursued a limited case against him, and then they hardly looked at his financial and other enablers. The feds didn't speak to or subpoena Les Wexner, Leon Black, or Jess Staley. They don't appear to have interviewed anyone at JP Morgan about its 15-year relationship. They concluded that Deutsche Bank was not guilty before interviewing key employees. This goes beyond a simple mistake or failure to investigate something further that really should have been. This is a pattern of state neglect that puts some of the most vulnerable children in the country at extreme risk of being abused by wealthy, powerful men. And fast forward to today, and that neglect isn't just in what the Justice Department is failing to do, but what it's doing in what seems to be a cover up of anything related to President Donald Trump. We already know that Trump has installed his own loyalists, including his own lawyer, in the Justice Department. So the people who are tasked with the Epstein investigation also have a vested interest in creating a partisan spectacle that deflects accountability from Trump himself. We've seen that play out in the way that the DOJ is tracking Congress members who are looking at unredacted Epstein files. And in some cases, they're actually going back into the files and redacting them after Congress people express interest. That's according to a report from Below the Beltway's Cam Stevenson, titled Dems in Congress Allege DOJ Spying on Their Searches to Remove Epstein Documents. So we already know, in part thanks to Pam Bondi's testimony in front of Congress, that the DOJ is tracking what specific representatives are looking at in the Epstein files. Multiple representatives have confirmed this on both sides of the aisle. They have a portal to access what are supposedly the unredacted versions of the files. But when they log on to that portal, they have a unique tracking number associated with their searches that the DOJ can then download to see exactly what they were doing and what files they were looking at. And Cam reports they are then subsequently actively redacting those same documents, often removing mentions of Trump. He goes on to write, redactions have been added as recently as this week, according to U.S. Representative Maxine Dexter, a Democrat from Oregon. Dexter visited DOJ offices on Tuesday with a list of files the House Judiciary Committee had asked her to review. Other committee members had previously accessed the files in their original form, but when Dexter attempted to view them, she found 255 pages of black rectangles. This is a quote from Dexter saying, literally, files other members have seen that I was supposed to follow up on are now gone. Multiple files that have been documented are gone. It may be that they're seeing what we're finding, and then that brings things to light. We have no idea. All of this is conjecture, but when the administration's making up stories about what's happening, what is real is that transparency is not the rule of the land. This comes after Trump claims he was exonerated by the files, and Republicans in charge of oversight have said the same thing. They claim that Trump is exonerated by the Epstein files at the exact same time they're actively scrubbing files that mention Donald Trump. It does not add up. And Kentucky Republican Representative Thomas Massey thinks that this cover up goes a step further. He says Trump's strikes in Iran this weekend were a cover up to distract and deflect from the Epstein files. Whether Trump's military interventions have to do with the Epstein files or not, one thing is clear. The federal government is involved in trying to hide things from the Epstein files from members of Congress and the American public, which is an extremely corrupt way to challenge the very balance of power and democracy in this country. It's also a massive injustice, a continued injustice for these victims and survivors of Jeffrey Epstein, who have had to wait decades for the federal government to do its job, which they have not only failed to do, but have actually done the opposite, putting up even more systemic barriers and making it even harder for victims of these heinous crimes to get justice for them. We don't know the extent of what Epstein was planning to do there or what plans he was able to accomplish, nor do we know just how many victims there were inside this New Mexico mansion. But what we do know is that the federal government has stopped justice from occurring, putting it to the point that it might be too late to reclaim some of the evidence that was left there. What we do know, and what we do still have, is the testimony of women like Annie Farmer who can tell us what happened at Zorro Ranch. And we have the concern and the desire from neighbors in New Mexico and state representatives to fully investigate and uncover the abuses of power and void of accountability that took place. If only the federal government could get in line with the program and help these victims as well as the public get justice, then we'd be in a good place. But unfortunately, right now, it's the little people who care about this versus the big man in the White House who wants to do everything in his power to stop it.